Welcome again. Thank you very much. The last speaker in the video, Moritz, says that dialogue can be personally transformative. What does that say about the nature of dialogue? Is it just a persuasive conversation? I'm asking the two of you, and whoever wants to respond first.
Well, let me simply begin by thanking you for this important link that we've just heard from the dialogue video that we saw. And I believe very strongly that it's potentially transformative if well done. In order to do dialogue, good dialogue, we really need to practice what we call 10 principles. And so we share sort of, in a back and forth way, we'll share those different 10 principles with you.
And the first one is really, I think, has to deal with the core of any disagreement with fear. In order to overcome our fear, we need this safe space that allow people to speak honestly and overcome that sense of what will happen if I say my opinion. And that come under the notion of safety. A second one has to do with the notion of learning. You see, when you come to dialogue, you're not coming to solve a problem. And I think that's a mistake to think about this way. You come to the dialogue to learn, as one of the fellows said, how ignorant you are. And when you discover that, you really feel guilty. And you really feel that you have wasted so many years of your life without meeting the other. Therefore, our first title in the dialogue usually, you are here to learn, and mostly about yourself.
And another principle, of course, is when you come together, we need to agree on the purpose. Why do we actually come together? What are the objectives? To set the ground rules from that angle, and work on the ground rules to go and abide by the dialogue. So these are two other principles.
Once we establish those, what we have is to convince people in the room it's okay to take a risk. To say that I think you all terrorists. Okay. Or I think you are all ignorant. Or I was raised to be afraid from you. To say these things in a dialogical setting, it requires risk and I think also a little bit of courage. If you don't say them, you're going to continue and live in your many of your stereotypes. And you'll be amazed how each one of us, how many stereotypes we have. But at the end, dialogue is really about building relationships among people who do not know each other. And also, it's not what you used to call in the Israel-Palestine, it's not hummus falafel meeting. It will help to have hummus and falafel.
I'm hungry.
However, you need to talk about hard questions, hard issues. Dialogue, if it doesn't relate to the hard issues, it's not going to lead to a genuine and honest interaction.
And that's precisely why when you actually practice true and deep dialogue, it can get pretty difficult. It can actually get rough internally in terms of how to struggle with what happens from learning from these different perspectives that maybe you did not expect. And so in that sense, you have to make sure that you do not quit. You do not quit, you stay with it. And that ability to be resilient in dialogue through the ups and downs that you discover along the way is essential. With that comes, of course, a process of transformation, that we have to be ready to potentially change some of our understanding and perceptions about the others that are involved with us in this dialogue or elsewhere in the world. So that's another very important thing. And all of this change that we go through makes us really believers in dialogue. And that's why many of us are so committed to dialogue, because we're transformed internally by that particular process. And so the last thing that we have in our 10 principles is to therefore have the responsibility to share that possibility of changing ourselves and others in the process. And that's part of our long list of principles.
But if I have understood correctly, what you've been saying refers to all sorts of dialogues. What makes interreligious dialogue special?
Well, obviously, all kinds of dialogues, will actually share a common basis along the lines of what we've said in many ways. Interreligious dialogue in particular is when you actually focus more on that part of one's global, complex identity that is more religious in nature for some of us. Obviously, some people are not religious, but others are. So for those for whom religion is important, then it's sharing about those important aspects in terms of beliefs, in terms of rituals, in terms of values, that actually explain why we do what we do in the world as religious people. And so the process of interreligious dialogue is to share this, to eventually identify commonalities out of which the common action can take place.
Many times people, when Patrice and myself work in this area, and he knows it even better than me because he comes from comparative religion, I come from peace and conflict resolution. They ask us, what do you do? Do you always debate theology? Do you talk about the prophets and the principles of theology? And we rarely do that. In fact, this is what we call a dialogue of theology, or a dialogue of theological dialogue. We don't do that. We do something we call dialogue of life. And dialogue of life is about how is my religious identity obstructing or facilitating my integration in the society as citizen, as contributing individual. So we focus on, we can talk about health, and then how does my religious identity help with health? We can talk about gender, and then we can talk about how does my religious identity help me to be more gender sensitive and less prejudiced against race, ethnicity, or whatever other issues. So we focus on the conflicts and the issues that people live them day to day. And we ask, how can your religious identity help you in that? And that's what we hope policymakers will pick up from our conversation in this area.
The two of you are very positively contagious, and but
Hope so.
and you are convincing people to share the dialogue. What happens if people refuse, if they don't want to engage the dialogue? Has that happened?
We give them hummus and falafel.
That's a good idea.
Yes, it has happened, of course, and it continues to be the case that there are a variety of different reasons why people actually don't want to engage in dialogue, and there's a few of them that we want to share with you because it's really important. First of all, when we meet some resistance, whatever the nature is to stop and to simply take the time to ask why you don't want to join. Why you don't like, this invitation, this open invitation for you to join this dialogue, circle, action, etc. And being honest with listening, first and foremost, to the answer given, so that you don't just dismiss the person on the, right from the beginning because they don't want to come, but rather you take the time to hear what is the nature of their perception about dialogue which makes them not want to come. Once that is clear, then you have to begin to take very specific examples that are counter-arguments to that particular perception about dialogue, to hopefully in the process change their mind and make them maybe take the first step towards taking the risk to come and participate in an event. But it takes careful planning in advance, and you don't necessarily spring this up on people who are afraid or somehow skeptical about dialogue. So there are many reasons for being skeptical, right?
Yeah, I mean, skepticism come from mostly fear why they don't come to the dialogue of affecting their identity. But my most difficult challenges with this has been throughout the work is when you find somebody who does not recognize the other side, their humanity, their group, their religion, with such a level of denial. It's very hard to convince them to come to the dialogue. And sometimes we meet people in security in areas where security is a real concern. I've met an imam in Somalia who lost 13 of his peers in the fighting. And they still call him to come for dialogue. And he still made the decision to come and speak with his enemies. This is more of an interfaith conversation. The last one which is the classic critique, dialogue does not produce justice. People don't come to dialogue because they have been victimized for so long, and you need to do lots of work as a preparation. One technique we do to overcome some of these challenges, we separate the two groups. We work separately for 2, 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, until the group is ready to say, I am ready to meet the other side. And that's one technique we use, and we take the themes with them.
Thank you,
And of course, there's the generic sort of, reaction that some people say that it's only blah, blah. Dialogue is just, empty words at the end. You're preaching to the converted, or anyway, it's only sort of high-level people that are doing this, and what's the point? And so these are all kinds of stereotypes, I think, that we know and we have encountered a lot of, and we need to address seriously.
Professor Abu-Nimer has already given an example of where he was really challenged. Can you also give us an example of where you found it particularly difficult?
Yes, I coming from a Canadian background, I think that if one, I grew up in a context whereby my primary identity was as a minority French Canadian. Until I start to realize that, yes, but within Quebec, I'm a majority. And not only that, but then of course, we've been part together with sort of the majority Anglo-Saxon folks in historically Canada, we've been part of a colonial system against Indigenous people. So in some ways, it's very easy to feel one's minority and much more difficult to realize when we're part of a majority dynamic, and therefore, in dialoguing with Indigenous communities, taking a step back to carefully listen and hear with as much openness and compassion as possible the critique that comes from that history and the underlying continuous injustices, structural injustices that are taking place regarding Indigenous communities is a real challenge for me. And I have to stick with it to continue that dialogue in a profound way if I really want to talk justice in real terms so that I can actually be part of more solutions than being part of the problem.
Thank you very much for sharing that with us.
I want to say that, as if you heard him carefully, it's very dangerous to be engaged in dialogue. It's not a simple business of talking. If you take it seriously, dialogue can be dangerous.
Well, then this is a dangerous last word for this section, but Professor Abu-Nimer and Professor Brodeur, I thank you very much. And I would ask you to take your seats again. And ladies and, big applause.